Welcome to Pollinator Partnership's Monarch Habitat Management and Technical Training webinar series. This series is an extension of the Monarch Wings Across Eastern Broadleaf Forest program and is made possible with the support of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I'm Elizabeth Kaufman, and I'm thrilled to welcome Pete Berthelsen, whose presentation will cover Monarch and Pollinator Habitat Management. Pete earned both his Bachelor and Master of Science in Wildlife Science and is currently the president of Conservation Blueprint. Pete is also the Partnership Director of the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund and worked with Pheasants Forever for over 25 years. He has also worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in North Dakota, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and the U.S. Forest Service in Michigan. Pete also serves on numerous steering committees and is the recipient of multiple awards and recognitions, including those from the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, the American Beekeeping Federation, and the National Association for Conservation Districts. Welcome, Pete. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm glad to be here. This is a topic that I love to chat with folks about. So I'm excited to be able to talk about pollinator habitat management today. So with that, let's kind of jump into it. And if I can, I'd like to expand on Elizabeth's kind introduction and give you just a little bit more information about me. This happens to be a photo of my lovely wife and I as we're conducting a prescribed burn on our native grassland in central Nebraska. And we have a farm and a ranch that's located in the Luss Hills of central Nebraska. And that's a landscape that is comprised almost evenly of rangeland and agricultural production that is in row crop production, primarily corn and soybeans. And I'm fortunate to be able to use our farm and ranch a little bit like an outdoor laboratory where we experiment with different management techniques and kind of document what those responses are, but it's certainly a working farm and ranch. And then I'm also an amateur beekeeper. Have kept bees for a number of years and have a passion and enthusiasm about working with bees. But at my core, really what I am is somebody that is highly motivated and has been working on trying to design, establish, and manage highly diverse habitat like we see in this picture for quite some time. So that's really a good little background on where I'm coming from as I'm talking to everybody today. And on today's webinar, we have a really diverse background in the audience. Everything from landowners to resource professionals and agricultural producers to people that are just really enthusiastic about pollinators and want to do what they can to benefit them. That's a really wide background, and we're excited that you're on today's webinar, and we're going to talk about a little something that will probably be able to touch all of this diverse background with some information that will be helpful for you. So as we get started, I want to give you 3 foundations that this presentation is coming to you from. And the first foundational thought is that when we get an acre of wildlife habitat or pollinator habitat, we need to make that the best acre of habitat that it can be. Because pollinators and other upland wildlife really have experienced significant declines in habitat over the last decade. So when we get the advantage of being able to have an acre, we have to make it the very best that it can be. The other kind of platform that this presentation comes off of is if we're going to try and solve pollinator limitations and problems using the same techniques and methods that we've been using for the last decade, we will fail. And I think monarch butterflies are a great example of that. If we're going to try and solve monarch butterfly habitat situations using the same techniques we've been using, that's probably not going to work for us. And kind of the last foundational thought is not all pollinator habitat is created equal. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in today's webinar, but just because a plant produces a flower doesn't mean that it has high pollinator value. So when we design our pollinator habitat, we really want to critically think about what our objectives are. And the Pollinator Partnership is offering to you a whole suite of webinar topics, some of which will talk exactly about that subject. So the first thing that I want to say on this webinar is that contrary to what you might hear or see on television, we don't have a time machine. And what I mean by that is, for me, one of the greatest frustrations in working on wildlife habitat can be when we're 3 or 5 years into the future and somebody is unsatisfied with the habitat results they got. In virtually every case, when that happens, it comes back to site preparation on the project or the management or lack of it that's being applied to that particular project. This is a pretty good image of what everybody thinks of and wants when they hear the phrase pollinator habitat. They want something that looks like the photo on the calendar in your office when you turn to the month of July, just like this one, a diverse area with all kinds of flowering plants. And if you've undertaken a pollinator project, it might very well look a little something more like this in year 1, and then you sprinkle in a little bit of time, and by about year 5, it might look something like this. Something less than what you really thought you were going to get. And today we're going to talk about how management, both in the year of establishment and down the line, can really have a significant impact on what your pollinator project looks like. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that much of your pollinator results, both in the year of establishment and in the future when you're doing management, all comes back to the foundation of what your original seed mixture was. The more highly diverse your original seed mixture, the more and wider pollinator benefits you're going to get from management in the future. So remember that that base, what you start with, is really important. And I want to give one update about the establishment of your project. I know there's other webinars talking about this, but this is really important to influencing what shows up on your project. And this is something that lots of people miss, and that's the importance of planting depth in your project. Right here we have 5 different pollinator plant seeds. And when we look at the species of those seeds, you see everything from milkweed all the way down to a different beard's tongue. The number that's written beneath those seeds is how many seeds it takes to make 1 pound of seed. And so we have our milkweed seed on there that has 70,000 seeds in a pound, all the way down to slender beard's tongue that has 10.8 million seeds in a pound. And that is a huge difference in the size of the seed. 154,000 times change in the size of the seed. And remember the rule of thumb when it comes to planting seeds. Any seeds, not just pollinator seeds, but the rule of thumb is that we want to plant a seed at 2 times the diameter of the seed. Well, many grass drills and planting methods are kind of designed to plant the seed at a depth of about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. Well, if our friend shown here, slender beard's tongue, is planted at a depth of 1/4 inch, you probably will never see slender beard's tongue in your planting. That seed will not germinate and grow because it was planted too deep. You cannot plant a seed too shallow. You can plant a seed too deep. So please bear that in mind as you're thinking about and looking at your planting depth. More on that in other webinars. One of the keys to establishment for a management technique that you might well use is mowing. And I want to give you a couple of keys to mowing. And the first thing that you should think about when you look at this photo is this photo shows you what not to do when you're mowing. Here's what I mean by that. Some of the keys are, the first thing is mowing height. If in the year of your establishment, you decide that you need to mow that pollinator planting, don't mow that planting shorter than 10 to 12 inches tall. If you mow it shorter than that, there's a high likelihood that you could damage the establishment of your young pollinator plants. The next thing is, think about when you start your mowing. If you're going to mow your pollinator planting, especially in the year of establishment, don't wait too long. Here's what I mean by that. If you're going to mow your planting when it's 10 to 12 inches tall, you should mow that planting when the vegetation is 20 to 24 inches tall. If you wait until the vegetation is 3 feet or 4 feet tall, like they're doing in this photo, there will be so much vegetation that you will create a mulch when you mow, and you could smother your new pollinator seedlings. So don't wait too long if you're going to shred. How often do I do that? The most I would ever say, and this is not something that you definitely should do, but the most would be 2 times in year 1 and once in year 2. After that, mowing would be used as a management technique that might come at the end of the season. And then just remember that if you're mowing, you're probably going to significantly impact any annual plants that are in your pollinator planting. Those plants have to be able to flower, produce viable seed, and distribute that seed to be able to remain in your planting. So mowing can remove annuals from your project. So how effective can mowing be in the year of establishment? Our friends at the Tall Grass Prairie Center in Iowa have a very nice study in which they've looked at mowing versus not mowing and have found that mowing in the first year for biennials and perennials can have a significant impact on helping them become established. One of the primary management considerations that you're going to have going forward in your pollinator planting is grass encroachment. Grasses are going to be one of the most significant forms of competition for the wildflowers in your pollinator mixture. And if you look at this photo here, you can see grass is really coming on and beginning to outcompete the forbs that are also in this photo. Here's a couple of things that you want to think about when it comes to grasses competing with your forbs. The first thing is you want to figure out what kind of grass is the problem. Is it a cool season grass or is it a warm season grass? The answer to that question will help influence what kind of management we do to the grass. The second thing I want to tell you is don't wait too long. If you wait until the grasses are already outcompeting your wildflower species, it's going to take a lot more work to set the grasses back. If you get ahead of that before the grasses start outcompeting your wildflower forbs, you won't have to put as much effort into it. And the third key for you is to plan for both year 1 and year 5. You always want to be thinking about your management and particularly grass competition well into the future. One of the things that we can do to really manage grasses when they are becoming competitive is if your grass competition is a cool season grass, smooth brome, fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, species like that, they have one weakness. And that weakness is if we wait until after you've had a hard freeze, 27 degrees or colder for 3 consecutive hours, all the wildflowers in your planting will have gone dormant for the year. But your cool season grasses are still growing, and we can apply a glyphosate application at a very specific time that I'll explain in a second, and you can get great results. Here's a photo of an area following a spring prescribed fire. The area that is in black was sprayed the fall before. And if we were out there standing on that, you would see all the grasses have been eliminated, but the wildflowers, the forbs that were dormant when we sprayed the glyphosate, are coming back and doing really well. There's key considerations if you're going to apply glyphosate. And I'm going to just kind of let you see these. You'll be able to slow this webinar recording down and take a look at them. But if you follow each one of these key considerations, you can have a tremendous impact on cool season grasses that are growing in your pollinator planting, especially if you're spraying them following these key considerations. If your competition from grass is not just a cool season grass, maybe you want to use a grass-selected herbicide. A grass-selected herbicide is a herbicide that will only influence grasses, so it won't affect your wildflower species. The first thing that I'll tell you from my personal experience is that a grass-selected herbicide is really effective on annual grasses, and on perennial grasses, you don't eliminate it, you just kind of stunt its growth for a year. The application of grass-selected herbicides is more effective following another management activity, say prescribed fire, like we see in this photo, or perhaps grazing or shredding, another activity that will set those plants back. Speaking of prescribed fire, what a great management tool to consider if it works in your area. Perhaps the single most cost-effective management tool that you can use. With prescribed fire, we're so enthusiastic about its use because of results like this. In this photo is an area that was burned this spring. Following the prescribed burn, here's the abundance of forbs that showed up following that prescribed fire. Our prairie grass species all evolved with fire and will benefit from it. Not be harmed by it, they'll be benefited by it. So prescribed fire is something that we really want to use. Another kind of prescribed fire that we want to use to benefit pollinator habitat can be a growing season burn. This is a prescribed fire that you use at a different time of the year, July, August, September, when the vegetation is green and growing. Your prescribed fire is less volatile, a lot lower flame length, a slower moving fire, and it has tremendous benefit to forb species. This is an example of an area that had a growing season burn conducted on it, and what it really did was significantly enhance those wildflower species. Another sort of thing that we can use for management, and this really goes to helping you use prescribed fire, is we can establish green firebreaks in our pollinator project. And a green firebreak is something that provides great pollinator value because we're using clover species in there. They green up very early, and it allows you to conduct a safer prescribed burn. Here's another advantage to using Green Firebreaks. Here's an aerial photo of a project that has had Green Firebreaks put into it. And because this project was divided into 6 pieces, one of the things that happens is we burn one piece in year 1, then we move to another piece in year 2, another one in year 3, and we keep rotating our prescribed fire around so that at the end of 6 years, this pollinator project is in 6 different stages of development because we've been rotating our prescribed fire. That gives you great pollinator habitat benefits and protects the rest of your pollinator habitat from the fire so that you still have the habitat available for pollinator species. Great way to use prescribed fire. Another really important management tool can be the use of grazing. Grazing, when it's used at the correct time and the correct amount of grazing, can be used to stimulate diversity in your pollinator planting and the control of encroaching grasses. Here's a couple examples of the type of grazing that can be used on your pollinator project. This first photo is called patch burn grazing. And in this photo, the foreground had a prescribed burn conducted on it that year. The background was not burned. The cattle respond to prescribed fire by going to the areas that were burned because they're providing nutritious, young, succulent green grass growth. By attracting the cattle to this portion of the project, you focus their grazing there and focus their grazing on the grasses that you're trying to eliminate. Another form of management with grazing is called high-intensity, short-duration grazing. In this example, the cattle are camped out on a portion of the project that was burned, and we put lots and lots of cows on there for a very short period of time. And that same field, 1.5 months later, looks like this. We bring in lots of cows, focus them on grazing the grass, and then they're removed, and we have a significant forb abundance response to that. Where grazing is concerned, I want to tell you about what I call new math. And that is where we take 1 + 1 and make it equal 4. And what I mean by this is when you combine management techniques, you get a much greater response. If you combine prescribed fire with grazing, you get a bigger response than you would get from prescribed fire alone or grazing alone. 1 + 1 can give you greater results by equaling 4 in an example like that. One of the last things I want to talk about is woody encroachment. This is an example of Siberian elm that's coming into a pollinator project. And if you don't do a little bit of management on a project like this each year, you end up having a project that gets away from you that's going to require a lot more work. So one of my concluding thoughts to you is whatever your management is, grazing, fire, herbicide application, whatever it is, do a little something every year. And by doing a little something every year, you'll have great pollinator habitat results that remain and last well into the future. That's today's webinar talking about different management techniques. I hope that you enjoyed it and took something out of that. I want to give a great shout out to the Pollinator Partnership for doing this series of webinars that talks about all kinds of great things, and the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund Conservation Blueprint appreciates the opportunity to chat about that. And the last thing that I want to tell you is that on a monthly basis, Conservation Blueprint distributes pollinator habitat tips. These are 2 to 3 minute videos that talk about a wide range of subjects. Please think about signing up for those. They're free of charge. We would love to share them with you and anybody else interested in pollinators. And I'd also be happy to take your questions offline after you've watched the webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth and say thank you very much, Elizabeth. I've had a great time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pete. That was a wonderfully informative presentation. I hope you all have enjoyed today's presentation as well. For additional information and to access downloadable materials regarding monarch habitat creation, including eco-regional planting guides, habitat manuals, and additional webinars, please visit us at pollinator.org, where you can find these materials and more housed under the Resources tab. I'd also like to encourage you all to share information regarding opportunities for citizen scientists to participate in monitoring programs, such as Monarch Joint Venture's Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, and to use the new Insight app, which was created to empower citizens to participate in observation-based pollinator research. Thank you again all for your interest.